Welcome to Fireside Adoptees, the Adoptee Fire series. We're pleased to have an interview for you tonight with Lynelle Long from Australia, all the way from Sydney. And there's a lot to say about Lynelle by introduction. She's a founder of ICAV, InterCountry Adoptee Voices, which she started in 1998. She's a Vietnamese adoptee residing in Sydney, in Australia. And ICAV under her has been built into an extensive worldwide network amongst InterCountry Adoptee community, provided one of the first platforms worldwide for InterCountry Adoptee-led organizations and individuals, giving them a chance to collaborate, share, encourage each other, regardless of the sending or adoptive country. Over many years, Lynelle has presented at a lot of different seminars to governments, related organizations, nationally, internationally, including adoption-related conferences. She's written and edited extensively. We'll be talking to her a little bit about that tonight as well, and finding out more about her experiences working with the Australian government, the federal government, and also the implications for adoption worldwide in terms of what intercountry adoption could be looking like in the future, what it's like now, what it could be like, and the sort of potential for reforms that might exist. Lynelle, we're really happy to have you here. So thank you so much for joining us tonight and being willing to speak with us.
Thanks, Greg. Great to be here.
I feel like having seen there was a first part to this interview that you gave with Janeice in August that was really wonderful. And as I mentioned to you informally here, it's kind of a hard act to follow. There were so many good things in it. But it did raise themes that I wanted to hit on and give you a chance to either elaborate on or even bring up new ideas or concepts that maybe you haven't had a chance to address with our group previously. So, for example, I think the most important thing here is to start with a little bit about your adoption story. I know you gave that before to Janeice, but for people who haven't listened before, could you tell us a little bit about your story?
Yeah, so I was adopted in early 70s from Vietnam to Australia. I was a 5-month-old baby. And when I say I was adopted to Australia, I technically wasn't legally adopted until age 16 and a bit. But my adoptive parents flew to Vietnam, picked me up out of the war. At that stage, Vietnam hadn't finished its war. It went till 74, I believe. So my father actually flew into Vietnam in the middle of, obviously the end of the war, and brought me back out to Australia and kept me with them until they formalised my adoption when I was 16 years old. So a little bit about my life in Australia. My parents had 4 biological children, natural to them, and they literally adopted just because of, at that time in Australia, there was a lot of media coverage about Vietnam War, of course, and then we had a few people that had adopted children out of that war. And my parents being missionaries, fairly strong religious kind of family, they had actually been missionaries in Papua New Guinea prior to the birth of their first child. So that kind of Christian mentality. So, of course, that whole save and rescue kind of thought, right. Let's save a child. Yeah. So that's the kind of, environment that I was raised in terms of, their ideas of adoption.
In fact, that leads directly into a question I had, which is about the interest of hopeful adoptive parents in adopting from other countries, and why do you think there is such a prevalence of that? Because it is obviously a theme.
Back then, I do think that back then in the 70s, it was more of the pure thought of let's help a child. Mm-hmm. It's very much changed, in the years that I've grown up and started to speak out in the sense that, it's become much more of a service for infertile couples. So back then you'll see that a lot of us from that era were adopted into families who had biological children. It was the norm. So it was really more altruistic and let's help a child in need. Whereas, in today's era and since, probably very much the 1990s and onwards, it started to become much more of a service for people who are struggling with fertility issues. So if you surveyed a lot of the intercountry adoptees who are, probably about 20 You know, it's pretty common for their stories to be much more about, I'm the only child adopted into this family and I don't have any, there weren't any biological siblings of the parents. Yeah.
Great. Did you
So,
find,
and also to answer that too, of course, there's been a big change and shift. So back when I was adopted, you know, the fees to adopt were very minimal. They were pretty much kept to what it truly costs to adopt a child, you know, pay for the legal paperwork, that type of thing. And as intercountry adoption boomed through the 80s and 90s and became a massive, you know, trade, you saw those prices increase. So intercountry adoption has changed significantly because of the huge amounts of money that could be made. And we're talking anywhere from $40,000 per child for an intercountry adopted child. So the other interesting thing is the adoptive families who have adopted, you know, in this 25-year period that I've been involved in anyway, is that you see the increase in wealth. So a lot of our adoptive families, particularly from the, you know, 1990s onwards, have been the more, you know, middle class to upper class kind of echelons of society, whereas back in my era, you could adopt a child even if you were still fairly, you know, on the lower class, you know, not as much income, because it wasn't as much about money then as it is now. So it's interesting to observe that. And I was talking to a domestic adoptee recently, and we're talking about the fact that, you know, there's a lot of money that changes hands for an adoption done from another country as compared to a domestic adoption, and how that's really changed and influenced in a big way the differences between the two.
you used the word trade here. I had not heard anyone use that, but that was a really, it's kind of a chilling word to hear, but it was very descriptive of the realities of what's going on here. And
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that intercountry adoption is a
part of
trade.
it, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
commodification of children. Yeah.
Very unfortunate, but that was an impactful word for me to hear you use that. And it's unfortunate that that is such an undeniable side of what's going on here. And I wonder, though, if you could talk about, in terms of what this does to somebody who is an intercountry adoptee and they find themselves stripped of their heritage, their culture, their identity in so many ways, what that has been like for you, and how it is to talk to other intercountry adoptees about that experience.
Yeah. It's interesting because I'm not sure if you know the guy Rabs. Actually, he's in part of your group, actually, and
Yes.
I see he's done his survey, right? It's been interesting because in talking to Rabs, and because we've kind of spread that survey throughout the world, for the first time, he's actually seen, you know, the differences between an intercountry adoption and a domestic adoption. And it always strikes me because I'm so immersed in this world that for me, it's just, you know, it's like breathing. I just know this stuff inside out and I know it in depth and from so many around the world. Whereas for a domestic adoptee, kind of becoming exposed to the extra complexities of intercountry adoption is a bit of a shock, and you know, pretty full frontal, because, you know, we've lost so much more in we share the things that domestic adoptees share in the loss of, you know, knowing who we are, not having access to our identity, having our adoption secret quite often, that kind of thing. But on top of that, we also lose, you know, we've got another whole country, culture, language, and most importantly, legislation. It's the legislation extra hurdle that really makes it difficult for intercountry adoptees, where we've got to navigate, you know, the extra legality of having our legal adoption stuff done in our birth country, which is often inaccessible to us. So trying to find, for example, just our birth certificate is so much more hurdles than a domestic adoptee who is trying to obtain that within at least your own country and culture, where at least you speak the language and you can read the language. For us who are intercountry adopted, you know, I haven't got my birth certificate because I haven't found it yet, but when we do find it, it's in another language. We can't even read it. So, you know, it's a whole nother layer of how on earth do I navigate dealing with my origins when I can't even read the language, and trying to find someone who you trust to translate it, you know, so things like that. Yeah. And definitely the cultural aspects and definitely the racial aspects. Race is a huge part of our adoptions, you know, couched with all the assumptions of being saved from a poverty-stricken country. But Most people think of that, but what they don't realize is, our biggest sending country is actually South Korea. They're a first world economy. Why are they still sending children out in such huge numbers? You've got to ask yourself that question, because adoption isn't about poverty from third world country to first world country. China is our second biggest sending country, and they are also, they're the world's second largest superpower. So why is it that we are actually having so many children sent out of these first world economies? And at such huge dollar values. So again, this is where that whole financial factor comes into play with intercountry adoption. That's typically not there as much in domestic space.
This relates to a question. One of the people, one of the intercountry adoptees that I've spoken to had said that one thing that grieved him a lot was that he felt like his government hadn't done enough to keep him.
Absolutely. It's another whole layer of loss. So when we grieve for our losses, included in that is the fact that not only have we been given away from our parents, most likely, and that's not always the case, because of course many of us were stolen or, our parents coerced, but also the fact that our government, contributed and overtly, stamped our passports, our visas to get us out of the country. And what you're seeing is just quite interesting in Korea right now with the work that Peter Moller is doing from Denmark, is that you're seeing, en masse, a whole heap of Korean adoptees finally looking at, their paperwork and actually realizing that en masse, the Korean government has not only stamped their passports and visas to get them out, but actually, they've obviously turned a blind eye to the fact that most of those adoptees have not even had an identity registered in Korea, so that, they could be sent out without really tracking how many. So when we talk about Korean adoptions and about the 250,000 that have been sent out, and that's usually the statistical figure, but I believe that number is much higher, because so many were actually sent out without being registered at birth, without any, real tracking of identity. So it's another whole layer when you've been shipped out en masse. And that happened to the Vietnamese. There is my cohort who were all sent out via Operation Baby Lift, sanctioned by the US government, led by the US government. And so many of those have no identity documents and have certainly no relinquishment documents. So you've got to ask yourself how those adoptions are even legal. And, of course, many of those adoptees haven't really critically thought about what their country has done as their adoptive country, and what their adoptive country has done to contribute to their lack of identity, and to the fact that, who knows how many of our birth families in Vietnam did they even know that we were being sent abroad? Most probably not.
Wow.
So it's a whole nother layer.
Do you find that with the natural desire to reconnect or reintegrate to some extent, that there is resistance within countries to, I don't know if reassimilate is too strong of a word, but to receive people back in with a certain openness?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in the Vietnamese situation, like I've actually been back, met with the Vietnamese Ministry of Justice, asked for post-adoption support, but they are not interested. They do not. Many of our birth countries want to keep us children forever in their mentality. So they think of us as perpetual children. They're a bit shocked, for example, when we turn up and actually talk about the fact that we want to en masse kind of come back and have dual citizenship or have visas to allow us to get back into our countries easier, things like that. And they have not thought about it, because they literally still think of adoption from the days, the dark ages when we were in the fog. That is where they still are. They're still in the fog. They still think of adoption as this rescue savior thing, because they're thinking of just our first basic essential needs, Maslow's hierarchy of your basic needs: food, water, shelter, clothing, warmth. They're not thinking of our self-actualization, which is our spiritual needs, our emotional needs, our need for a sense of belonging to our birth country. They did not think about that when they decided to send us all out from our countries. And I got that as well very clearly from especially the Chinese government, who I met when they came here and sent their delegation to meet Australia. they were shocked actually to actually see an adult intercountry adoptee standing in front of them, Chinese, who's, like in her early 50s actually. And when we were asking, is it possible for those Chinese adoptees to be able to have an easier visa to come back and visit and live, study abroad in China, learn to absorb, the country and the culture, they just had no clue what we were talking about. So many of these countries, they have not heard from many of us because, of course, we've got the language barrier. So it's not as simple as just going back and speaking to the Chinese government, because you've got to be able to speak Chinese if you want to be able to communicate. And most of us don't. We are so separated from our origins. And most of us do not ever get to be taught or learn our country of origins language. So that's a huge barrier just to even begin with. We can't even converse with our government that we were born, from the country we were born in. So huge barriers.
It almost sounds like they feel that they gave you what you needed to survive. You mentioned the hierarchy of needs, and then all of this piece about your identity and integration as a self. They can't fathom that, and you're a child in their minds forever, and that's kind of out of the picture for them.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, actually probably a lot about ICAV, and in more detail for the people listening, how that came about, and the importance that it's exhibited for you.
Yeah, there's a lot in that one. Okay, so I'll start with how I began. So it literally began because of my own isolated experience, not knowing other adoptees while I was growing up, not having any mirrors racially, culturally, to even understand, myself. I grew up white with a white mentality, and I hated being Asian. I hated my physical looks. I thought I was ugly. I did not at all in any way want to connect to my origins in terms of a race. So it took me a lot of years to really overcome that. And I always tell the funny story about how, even for my husband, who's actually a Chinese third generation Aussie, I didn't date him for 3 years because I was so racist towards my own people. I just saw him. I was always like, I don't see Asian guys as attractive. That was my mentality then. So of course I've shifted significantly because I had to overcome that to end up marrying someone who was of my race. And it's really strikes me as quite sad when I look at my children now and realize, that they're actually beautiful children. And I'm just like, wow, how did I grow up feeling so ashamed of my looks, of my race? And it's such a reflection of how whitewashed I was. And that is such a common theme amongst intercountry adoptees and transracial adoptees, where we grow up so whitewashed, or whatever the racial background is of our adoptive parents. It's usually what we absorb and what we get taught as this is the norm, and your own country and people and race often get demonized in subtle ways or overt ways. So I created ICAV as a space because there was nothing for people like me. And certainly when I went searching for support, I didn't find anything. So essentially, I realised that there was a massive gap and we needed to do something about it. So I started in Australia. We did a book, The Colour of Difference, which brought together transracial adoptees for the first time in Australia together. And we wrote a book, The Colour of Difference. And then from that, I actually met my first intercountry adoptees, because some of them were transracial domestic. But I did meet my first intercountry adoptees together for the first time. And that was just it just blew me away at how much we connected, how much we had in common, how this sense of belonging that I'd never actually experienced in any of my white spaces in Australia before. And it was such a powerful influence on me that's why I thought I've got to replicate this for other adoptees, because I can't be the only one to experience it. So hence, why ICAV began and why we grew. And as soon as, because I worked in IT, I think I was working at IBM at that time, I knew to create a website. And immediately when I created ICAV as a website, I got people requesting to join from the Netherlands, from Germany, from Belgium, from all over the world, the UK. And I immediately just let them join, because it was like, yeah, there is no other spaces for us, right? So that's why from the beginning, ICAV was never just about Australian intercountry adoptees. It allowed people from all over the world who identified with this intercountry adoptee experience to connect in. My time in Australia was really interesting. It was kind of good luck and all this stuff kind of coming together, I guess. But essentially what happened in Australia is there were a lot of adoptive parents in Australia who at that time were complaining to the government. And it ended up culminating in a formal inquiry. We had a federal commission that basically looked at intercountry adoption in the whole of our country over the last 20 years or so. And it looked at, what was going well, what wasn't going well. And because we had just formed and we were fairly strong and very active, myself and the representatives from my organisation, we actually went to this hearing and we got heard. There's actually transcript of that, and I read back on it now and think, wow, the issues then are still the same.
Wow.
But yeah, it was the first time adult intercountry adoptees in Australia had been able to speak at a government inquiry that looked at, what were our experiences like and how was it really? And we spoke about a lot of the needs that we still have, about the lack of post-adoption supports, a lot of, the lack of help for us, particularly with our countries of origin in trying to either return back or search for our, biological families. So many barriers that we have that hadn't been thought about by our government. And so my involvement in that, the outcome of that inquiry led to the formation of the Australian government setting up a group that was to advise the federal government on how to go forwards on intercountry adoption. Now, out of that group, there were 17 positions. 16 of them were all filled by adoptive parents, and this was the government creating these spots, and one was created for an adoptee, which ended up being me. Yeah. So I was the only adoptee amongst 16 adoptive parents, and we spoke up at government level. Now, one of the very first things I said was, we need more adoptees in this. Why is there only one? Because that shows you how skewed everything was and still is in many countries like yours in America, where you're still largely dominated at government level by adoptive parent voices being heard, but not the adoptees. So for the next 2 years, I sat on that, and that was kind of like my launch pad into really understanding the political and legal scene at government level, of understanding how do countries communicate and work together to formalise and bring children from one country to another. So that was my learning pad, where I heard directly from the government as to how they negotiated those discussions with other countries that they decided to have sending country agreements with. And then from that, I guess, my experience there really helped me to become stronger in speaking up, because I realized, what an imbalance it was, that so many adoptive parent voices were heard, but yet there was just barely any adoptee voices. So that really spurred me to start to think more deeply about, well, this is probably reflected around the world, which it is. And so from that, I actually took a break for a few years. Now, that's a good point to highlight to a lot of adoptees who want to be activists, is it is really healthy to take breaks, because you can't just be in this stuff all the time and not kind of look after yourself and balance your life out. Sure. It takes a lot out of people, and it did for me. In those early days, I was not political, so I was still trying to toe that I'm grateful, I've been saved, I'm lucky, adoptee kind of party line. Right. And I'm so grateful to be here at this government forum, blah, blah, blah. So I took a break, and in that break, I really thought about, what was needed, and what did I want to do. And I decided, and it was reflected in the name change, because back in that time, my network was called InterCountry Adoptee Support Network. So essentially we were together like you guys are, was literally to support each other, to connect to each other, to have a platform to tell our stories, and to really just support one another as peer-to-peer. So when I had that break, and after my involvement at government level, I came back and I changed our name to InterCountry Adoptee Voices, because first and foremost, I realised our voices were not heard. And secondly, I realised that we needed to get politically involved to represent ourselves, no longer having to pair ourselves with adoptive parents because they had the power, but to be on our own 2 feet and kind of stand up for ourselves. So I took a group of, I think we had about 12 of us. I chose selectively. a group of 12 intercountry adoptees who had a fair bit of experience already by then at speaking. And we went and sought a meeting with what is equivalent of your president, our prime minister. And we spoke about what our needs were. And from that decade, years later, we were successful in our advocacy at government level. We now have free inter-country adoption counselling for all inter-country adoptees, which includes our partners, our children, our parents on either birth or adoptive family side. And that's a fantastic service. And I identified that as one of our key pivotal supports. It was absolutely essential and should be there for every baseline adoption service in the world. If you're going to adopt, and you're going to do it ethically, you have to provide free counselling for all of those people who are impacted. So that was our first baseline request. And then the second one was our search and reunion. Now, we were lucky to be funded a free search and reunion service for all intercountry adoptees in Australia for 2 years, but unfortunately they decided not to fund it any further. Not sure what the reasons, but there were quite a few political reasons for that. But yeah, so that kind of, and then from there, because I'd always been involved at a global scale, I ended up getting invited to speak at The Hague because of my connections.
Great. Yeah, that's very, and obviously that's a very dignified and prestigious honor for anyone to think of internationally. What was the experience like for you?
Yeah, The Hague, that's like stepping into lion's den. It's because essentially, I'm not sure if any of you know what The Hague is. If you're domestic, you probably don't know, but essentially the way that intercountry adoption works globally is that there are 104 countries that have actually signed a convention about intercountry adoption, where they've gotten together, they've formed the convention as to what are the rules to which, from country to country, we will agree to send and receive children. And these 104 countries who are now signatories of that, they try and uphold these as principles. Now, that actually was created in 1998 because of the trafficking that went on en masse in the 80s and the 90s, where there were just children being bought and sold all over the world with horrific outcomes and all sorts of things going crazy. So the governments around the world realized this trafficking, we've got to somehow curb it. We've got to somehow control it. I don't think they were unrealistic to think they'd ever stop it, but at least they could try and put in place some kind of framework that at least brought to government's attention, this is what you've got to do as a minimum to try and curb the trafficking that can happen if you don't have any regulations in place. So The Hague has been effective in a sense, but in a sense too, I think it's created what you'd say a blindness for adoptive parents who are blindly just believing that The Hague is the be all and end all, that it's going to prevent trafficking, when in fact it doesn't do that at all, because The Hague is it's like saying, here's a set of rules. It's like a Bible. We're going to have a Bible to tell you how to do intercountry adoption, but it's up to you how you want to believe it or interpret it. So, of course, you've got many interpretations of the Bible, and you've got many, many countries who implement it one way or do it a different way. And so there can be still many gaps and problems in ethical and legal issues that actually get through the system without really people as the end buyer, which is your adoptive parents, really understanding what they've participated in. And that's coming more to light nowadays as people are starting to talk about the illegalities, the illegal adoptions, the illicit adoptions that have happened en masse. So The Hague is kind of like the peak of where you go if you want to be heard about intercountry adoption at a government level. So my goal, because of my involvement at the Australia level, I always knew what The Hague was and how it worked. And so I knew that I was trying to get to The Hague because it was so important for our voices to be heard there. Right. And mainly too, because I'd been successful, of course, being heard in Australia. So it gave me a bit of a template for how do you talk to governments? How do you actually advocate successfully with them responding in a positive way? There's a very fine line between saying what you need to say and saying it in a respectful way that doesn't get government or those in power offside to go, oh, we don't want to even hear from you because you're just too angry or you're too emotionally laden for us to even hear what you're saying.
Sure.
So there is a bit of a balancing act in in having a voice that's heard effectively. Because, of course, many adoptees, when you first come out of being in the fog, we can be very much clouded by our emotions and how we talk about adoption. And we can be very emotive rather than being logical and rational in what we want to say. So saying it effectively is real learning curve, which I had, a few years to kind of, get under my belt before I got to The Hague. And being there, well, it's a political minefield because you've got so many different countries with such different points of view. It really is interesting because you've got some sending countries who are amazingly on top of understanding our adoptee journey. And then you've got some sending countries, birth countries, who are really backwards and in the fog, I would say. You got some adoptive countries who are very, very aware of adoptee voices and very respectful of those, versus you've got some countries who just want to deny and ignore them and basically just not even listen to them. Unfortunately, the US is in one of those where, they still just want to pretty much deny your adoptee voice and not really take it seriously at all, which is quite sad. Because you've got the biggest population of intercountry adoptees actually in the US. So there's quite a forceful power there if we could unite those intercountry adoptees and get them speaking up loudly enough to demand that they be heard at that government level and demand to be taken seriously. There's still quite some work to get to that space. Yeah.
That's actually one of the questions I had, which is whether you find certain countries more amenable to listening, to reform. Yeah. And why you think that might be. And it's disconcerting to hear that the US is not one of those countries. I think we instinctively knew that, but yeah. But you can
see it. Yeah, you can see it. For example, at the last meeting that I attended at The Hague, I actually asked the countries and I said to them, you all might think that you all have post-adoption supports out there available for the community, but unless you're tapping into that community of impacted people, they're not knowing what your support services are. So I actually wrote to every single one of them after the last Hague meeting, and I said, on ICAV, we have listed all the post-adoption services that adoptees are providing. What we'd love to know is, where are your services as a government, and how do our adoptees know how to connect into them? So I'll put them on my website if you send them to me. What you can see on my website for post-adoption services are the countries who are very pro-adoptee. So you have Belgium, you have Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, Australia, Canada, all providing their post-adoption services so that adoptees can actually find them. What you don't have is the USA in any shape or form, because they'll just go, oh, we don't provide post-adoption support. It's provided by, our domestic space. And they don't take any responsibility, and they say that very overtly. It's not our mandate under intercountry adoption to provide any post-adoption support. And I'm just like shaking my head going, well, it's not under anybody's mandate in any country of the world to have to provide post-adoption support. But usually, if you're a government with some ethics, you would actually provide it, right? Because you just know that that's good practice. So it's interesting to see in the USA that they don't provide any, and they haven't provided a list, even though they know that is the one demand, the one request that adoptees have asked for a long time. So it's pretty reflective of the political agendas of governments as to whether they want to provide post-adoption support or not.
There's a huge humanitarian component, just as the people going through it who want that kind of support and are not able to find that, and it's exhibited as a level of indifference and lack of compassion at a governmental level. And it ties into not everyone, of course, will have the opportunity to engage at the government level with issues around adoption. Do you have any recommendations for people who do want to mobilize or be advocates that maybe won't have some of the same opportunities to do that? For instance, we have Fireside Adoptees, and it's a chance for people to come together and talk and share about things. But do you see avenues and places where people might be able to kind of serve in these capacities, even if they're not able to avail themselves of something at more, let's say, a government level?
It starts off in the tiniest ways, and that's what ICAV's always been about. It's about empowering every adoptee to be active in whatever way they feel. Not all of us want to be activists. Not all of us want to go to government meetings, but adoption and changing the way adoption is done starts at the tiniest ways in terms of just speaking out your story, saying your truth, challenging the mainstream mantra, the narrative. It begins with each of us just having a desire to actually speak out and not be afraid to say our truth and to challenge anybody, everybody, wherever we are, in whatever walk of life we live, to actually make a difference and try and help people become more aware of the complexities that are adoption, because so many of the public who are not affected by adoption still live in that fairy tale of how our mainstream media and film and TV portray adoption.
Yes.
And I just encourage anybody, in whatever you're doing, whether that be starting a group like Fireside, whether that be running an art initiative to highlight the artistic voices of adoptees, or whether that be through music or whatever you do, it can all add up to a way to help to make change in this area. There is so much change that's needed, so much work to be done, and we can all do our own little bit in whatever way we choose. There is not one right or wrong way. And I even say that in regards to adoptee groups who are very heavily involved in advocacy. One thing I don't agree with and don't like is the infighting that can happen, and the backstabbing, and the, really pulling down each other. I don't believe in that at all. And I really encourage adoptees to, if you don't like the way someone's doing something, just leave them be, get on with what you're doing and focus on what you're doing and put your energies into that. Why rip each other apart? We have so much work to do. There are so many multiple pathways to get it done. And we can all coexist, just like adoption all coexist with our many different numerous experiences, so too can advocacy and change coexist in all the multiple ways. So that's the kind of message that I say when I speak about things.
That's really edifying for, I think, everybody listening, and hopefully people will take that to heart as feeling like there's a contribution that each of them may have in their own way. And certainly, as you've mentioned, the ability to share your story, the ability to present yourself as somebody who's, in a sense, an ambassador. It doesn't necessarily mean a political ambassador or at a certain level, but as somebody who speaks for the experience of being an adopted individual. Just the opportunity.
And one thing I just want to say, Greg, I forgot to mention is you don't need money to do this. Like everything I've done, apart from 2 projects over 24 years, I've done without any funding. So people don't need to form this entity that's formalized. They don't need funding to do things. You can do things just by running. I mean, I can guarantee you guys are running this without any funding, right? This is the beginning of how you create change, is getting adoptees together, empowering them to find their voices, empowering them to be true to their experience and to say, and to be able to be effective communicators of this experience. So you don't need money. You don't need huge, amazing entities that have to be structured. There's so much that can be done with, with just your baseline stuff. Yeah, people forget that. They think that they've got to have some grand plan. I certainly did not begin this 24 years ago thinking, oh, I've got this grand plan to get to The Hague. It just evolved, literally. It has just evolved. I have just followed my heart and stayed true to what I needed to do. And that's what guides me. So I don't have a grand plan every year about what ICAV's doing. I literally just wing it, and I just basically go with what I feel is the right thing to do.
Wonderful. Really, really encouraging and supportive. And I think a very timely message for people that are wondering what they can do to be heard, to advocate for themselves and for their friends and other people in the community, and to feel centered and that their voices are being heard and amplified.
Yeah, so and the most important thing is to actually look after yourself and really stay true to your own emotional journey, and make sure you got the support in place. Being involved in a public way means that, you can often get attacked, you can often get criticized. You've got to be able to withstand that. And that means, having, like, I still have a counselor that I turn to for supervision, because, when I'm in this kind of space, there's a lot of people that that look to me and turn to me and ask me for things. And I've always got to make sure that I'm being true and that I'm, you know, not getting involved in someone's toxic game dynamic, because some adoptees, you know, can have some pretty toxic kind of dynamics going on. You've got to be able to, you know, withdraw yourself from those spaces when you can see that. And that's one of the areas that I've had huge learning in, because, you know, over this many years and dealing with this many adoptees, there's been some pretty painful learning moments for me where I've, you know, I've been triggered myself. And without that professional or that support to turn to help me unpack and work out what that was, you know, I don't want to replicate any further trauma in the spaces that I'm in, because we are a very vulnerable population. And one of the hardest things of working in it is actually dealing with people's trauma and trying to not get wrapped up in their toxic dramas if they're in that loop. Yeah.
Very, very, very important to have said what you said. Really, I used the word timely a minute ago. It's also timely here because a number of us have been through that and have experienced that. And it's something we're all susceptible to, unfortunately. But it helps us to remember the huge human component of this, is that even in some of our interactions where we mean the best and the other people mean the best, that the trauma element can come to the top, come to the surface, and create dissonance or damage within the community. And the fighting and the things that you mentioned, which are so heartbreaking, are unfortunately a reality and something we do deal with at all these levels. I wanted to thank you so much for the genuineness of that response and for everything else you've shared, Lynelle. We're really grateful for the time you spent with us tonight. Where can people find you if they'd like to learn more about you?
I have my website, so www.intercountryadopteevoices.com. I'm always on Facebook Messenger. That's the main way that people communicate with me. As adoptees, I get adoptees through Messenger. For the professional space, for people who work in adoption, usually it's LinkedIn. So I have a big network there as well with a lot of the government connections that I have.
Wonderful. And I've found you on LinkedIn and have seen a lot of great things that you're putting out. Again, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, definitely. What we will do is we'll conclude this part of it, which is the recording piece of the interview, and move on to the next section of question and answered offline here. But I want to thank everybody for watching, and please watch the Fireside YouTube channel. So Fireside Adoptees YouTube channel will have our interviews available, including this wonderful one with Lynelle. And we'll stop recording now. Thank you so much, everyone.